Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our new format, Political Economy of Forbes 15. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to announce my guest today. It's William Hynes. He's the head of the New Approaches to Economic Challenges unit of the OECD. He's also an adjunct professor of SAIS, Johns Hopkins in Bologna. So thank you, William Hynes, for your time today.
Thanks, Nicholas.
As a first question, because we talked before, you're now based in Ireland because you say the OECD in Paris is shut down, so to say, the office. How did the coronavirus pandemic affect all the working processes, like the structures in your unit at the OECD, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, well, obviously I think the OECD shut down more or less in mid-March, and we have a conference center where we bring together delegates from all around the world to discuss. And the OECD is really one of its key strengths is it is a network of different policymakers. And so that function has essentially transferred to a more virtual online presence. In a way, it's been a very clean transition. And as a lot of people have been saying, this is probably the way things are going to go in the future, that we can rely a lot more on these types of technologies. And we've continued with our meeting series. We've had people like Paul Krugman, Michael Spence, Danny Roderick. We have Larry Summers on Friday. So the dialogue has continued. It's been possible to do that. A lot of internal meetings have also gone online. And it's also been possible to maintain that. And a lot of our research work and analysis continues as before. So actually, we've been able to adapt pretty well to the shutdown. And our big annual meeting on integrative economics took place just before the OECD shut down. So we had that face-to-face interaction with academics, with policymakers, and those from our strategic partners. So it's been a disruption, but I think the disruption in our working methods or in our approach have been dwarfed by the impact it's had on our work, because we, of course, have been looking at the complexity and interconnectedness of the global economy. And also in the last year, we've been talking about systemic shocks. And we even had a conference last year called Averting Systemic Collapse, which was really about how all these different systems interact and are subject to cascading failure. So in a way, what's happened has been a validation of the approaches that we've been taking, the methods that we've been using, and the narratives on the fragility of our systems, human-made systems. So it's generated a lot more work and interest, and I think that is the more significant impact on our work rather than the actual impact on the physical interaction or the office arrangements.
Let's talk about the New Approaches to Economic Challenges unit where you are the head. It's about questioning traditional economic ideas and to enhance or also to improve new economic tools and methods. And I question myself, what projects are you specifically working on right now? And how should these new methods and tools should be implemented by countries on the policy level?
Right. Yeah. Well, good question. I sometimes ask that question myself, particularly the last one, and certainly our members do. Our member governments. The reflection and thinking about how the economy works and how it interacts with different systems. That's a very interesting academic discussion. But what does it mean for policymakers? But in terms of what we actually do, there's basically three areas of work that we have in NIC. The first is understanding the economy, understanding systems, and the narratives that we have to convey some of this new thinking to policymakers and the public. And there we've developed a new narrative of growth with an advisory group. And the basic argument is that if the 20th century was all about efficiency and structural reform to make the market mechanism work better, about competition and flexibility. All these things, if these were hallmarks of economic policy in the 20th century, then in the 21st century, we're going to have to be a lot more about managing these complex systems, ensuring their resilience, and making sure the system works in a way which doesn't leave us vulnerable to shocks. So that's the type of narrative that we are advancing. It's also one which has a lot of implications for policy in a whole range of areas. So, for instance, the role of the state in industrial strategy, the role of structural reforms, making labor markets more flexible, making product markets more competitive, the role of financial markets, how well does finance serve us? How well does it provide the necessary capital for small and medium-sized enterprises to help us with long-term needs? And is it something that benefits society as a whole, or just those participants in the financial markets? Then there's a range of social environmental questions, because part of this narrative, of course, is not just about making sure that the economy is doing well, but also thinking about the economy in the context of a broader societal framework and resting on those ecological foundations on which we depend. And we're quite critical in this work on the incremental traditional approach, which treats environmental issues as an externality, which tries to amend, adapt, reframe the original neoclassical model by essentially bolting on inclusiveness considerations or environmental considerations. We think a much more transformative approach to the field is needed, and really to think about systems, interaction, tipping points, feedback loops, all of these facets of complex systems, because the economy is not just a stripped down, closed equilibrium system which will get knocked off course, but then will have a natural tendency to self-stabilize or get back to a steady state. That's an idea which informs a lot of our analytical approaches. And it's not just our models, whether it's computable general equilibrium models or dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. It's more important the model that each of us has, the implicit model we have in our heads about how we assume things work. And that's really what needs to be challenged, because if you think that the economy is a self-stabilizing system, then you don't really worry about shocks. And you don't really think about some of these complexity phenomena, but these are not minor elements of the system. They actually define the system. So getting the narrative and the stories around this right, challenging the existing ones, I think is really important. A second area of work is systems thinking, anticipation, and resilience. And for policymakers, you need all three, because you really need to understand the systems, how they evolve, how they change, how they self-organize. In some cases, some of these systems do have the ability to be naturally resilient. You know, a competitive market can be one which can reorganize and reallocate resources quite quickly. So that's a good thing. But resilience is taken as a much more fundamental system characteristic. And it's one where, if, for example, the social system, if it isn't inclusive, it can't be resilient. And if it's not sustainable, then again, it cannot be resilient. So resilient is an overarching system property. And anticipation, if you understand how the system works, and you see it not as a stripped down equilibrium system, but as a very complex system, then you can bring a lot of different disciplines to bear on that problem, whether it's understanding the physical and natural sciences of environmental systems, or the anthropology and sociology of social systems, through the economic system, which needs to be viewed through a whole range of lenses, whether it's econophysics or neuroeconomics, or thinking about this, what we call integrative economics, one that is integrating a whole range of different insights. And if you understand those things, then you can anticipate a bit better shocks which are exogenous, which is the sort of classic economic problem that your economy gets hit by an exogenous shock, and then you throw resources at it, you try to reform to get things back on track, but also the endogenous shocks. What sort of interaction between agents in market can generate these endogenous crises, like financial crises or other economic shocks? And if we understand those things, we can anticipate a lot better. And if you anticipate, then you can build resilience. And so we've been working with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is in Austria. And we've just published a report called Systemic Thinking for Policymaking. And we're working on the systemic resilience part of it with the Army Corps of Engineers, researchers from that institute. And they're used to using scientific and engineering logic to look at the issue of resilience. And I think an engineering perspective on the economy is one that has often been there, as has a science perspective. It's just that in more recent decades, we were a bit more distant from those perspectives, and perhaps that now is returning. And so that's the second area of work. Then the third area is on the tools and techniques. So if you believe that the economy is a complex interacting system that is adaptive, then you can't really stick with the traditional tools and techniques that we use, but we need to look again to natural sciences and other disciplines to look at agent-based models, which are models based on simple rules of behavior where the interaction of different agents leads to systemic properties. It's not a top-down system where we impose a set of axiomatic assumptions on how the system works. It's more bottom-up. We look at how the agents interact and produce these emergent phenomena. The same with network models. The economy, global value chains, financial markets, they're all network phenomena. So we should think in terms of networks. And again, with that type of approach, we can simulate. And so simulation in economics is becoming a much bigger deal. And so we're trying to be at the forefront. And then when it comes to analyzing data and information, we have machine learning, we have big data, and these are much easier to sell because everyone has to work with qualitative information. How do we best make sense of this? How do we use the potential of big data to provide policy insights? So these are the broad areas. How do we make this relevant to policymakers? Well, I think it's not, since we started in 2012, it's not that the ideas that we've been advancing have been taken on board and people are very keen to have these discussions. The opposite is probably true, that there's a lot of human capital that is tied up in the more traditional way of thinking about things. And also, if we're talking about integrative economics, then we're talking about breaking the monopoly that economists have on these problems. And so there's been a lot of resistance. And also the assumption that the OECD is a policymaking institution, and these questions are very academic. So why is the OECD getting involved in this? And so there's been pushback, and then also the traditional pillars of authority tend to be our Economic Policy Committee, and we're based in the Office of the Secretary General. So many have questioned that. So there's been a lot of questions, but I think we are making some progress, and we're moving more in the direction of trying to take the next step and actually institute policies and come up with policy advice on the basis of these understandings. And there's a lot of proof of concept, experimentation, discussion, and engagement with policymakers, and I think that's necessary. But I think crises like COVID-19, and if you look at what's happening in our societies and in our natural environment, you would think it would make it a lot more easy to sell, because I think the inadequacy of our traditional approaches and our traditional ways of understanding is being really questioned. And people on the street, journalists, I think get that, but the economics establishment and institutions like the OECD, it's still a bit of a fight.
The that would be my next question. Why do you think it's such a fight? Because like these narratives that you mentioned before, like systems based on optimization, efficiency, competition, because they lasted such a long time that it's not so easy to transform them or to adapt them into the 21st century. Maybe is this one reason? Because I also thought that maybe like the COVID-19 crisis could be an option, a positive way to rethink systems being more resilient. So why do you think there are still not so positive signs to change or adapt these systems?
Yeah, well, remember the evidence-based answer to whether the Earth revolved around the sun or the sun revolved around the Earth. The Ptolemaians felt that had ever increasingly complex models to explain the observations, to justify that in fact the sun clearly revolved around the Earth. So for thousands of years, that position held sway. It's very difficult to displace a paradigm and a way of thinking. Another example is that their leading physics journals were still publishing articles about the impossibility of man-made flight long after the Wright brothers. So there is an inertia. There is a reason why bad ideas stick around. And it's because we're used to using these frameworks and we're used to making these models work. And what we get a lot is that, well, you don't have an alternative. Or they say yes, you have frameworks, but they're not as worked out as our existing framework. So we should really focus on improving the existing tools and techniques. But remember, they've had 200-year head start on working out all the facets of the neoclassical framework. So I think it's partly psychological, it's partly sociological. The economics profession itself, people like James Heckman have talked about the dangers of conformity. Paul Romer has also talked about the problem of macroeconomics, that basically there's a deference to authority, which tends to lock in existing and traditional ideas. And also these narratives, I think, the neoliberal narrative of economic policy has essentially won the argument. I think people and voters, governments, policymakers generally accept the idea that we should have an economy that is competitive. And as the slogan of neoliberalism, there is no alternative. And I think people think that's still the case. And anything else would involve massive state intervention and higher taxes and intervention in the smooth running of the economy. And it's very easy to sell the idea that we should focus on economic growth. It's a very simple narrative, and let's not complicate it by trying to use economic systems to solve social problems. Leave that to social policy. Or environmental challenges, well, it's not really got to do with the economy, but all of these things are interacting and they're interconnected. So it's I think we're still in a battle for the narrative, and it's one that is very, very difficult to displace. And the fact that the frameworks, tools, techniques, the existing ones seem more advanced, but only if you haven't been looking at what's going on in other fields. And so it's the insularity of economic models that's a problem. And it's not like those advising governments to say, well, we don't understand, or our forecasts don't seem to have any predictive power. Or as Mervyn King and John Kay have recently written a book on radical uncertainty, which basically argues that there are things that we just don't know, the unknown unknowns. And I don't think economists are very good at admitting what they don't know. And so there's a whole set of reasons why there's so much inertia in the system, and why things like Nike are dismissed as being ideological because they challenge the dominant way of thinking. But to say that policies that advance flexible labor markets or minimum wages or cutting social programs in the name of efficiency, to say that they're not ideological, I think isn't very accurate. And only if you question the prevailing orthodoxy are you considered ideological. So there is something of a disconnect. And then evidence-based, again, going back to this idea that policy should be evidence-based, I completely agree. But that can also prevent you from actually moving into any new areas because of the lack of an evidence base. So experimentation, trying out things can be impeded by this need to have evidence-based, or at least evidence conceived in a very traditional way based on econometrics or empirical work. We need to move more towards knowledge-based policy, which can have theoretical debate, can have conceptual discussion, and can look to a broad range of evidence and not just empirical or data-driven evidence.
There are also many talks or comparisons to the last financial crisis, 2008. I want to refer to a BBC article where the economist Todd Knopp said, to put it simple, that policymakers are now better equipped and know better how to respond to crisis now than in comparison to 2008 and also during the Great Depression in the 1930s. That also, like, in total, the financial systems are in better shape now than in comparison to 12 years ago. Would you agree to that statement?
Well, I think I'd partially agree in that there are some elements that I would agree with. Like, for instance, the way in which we deployed fiscal and monetary stimulus in response to the last crisis did probably avert a repeat of the Great Depression. I think the rapid deployment of fiscal and monetary firepower in response to the COVID crisis shows that we have learned the lesson that these systems are not going to self-stabilize, and that you need to take very rapid steps to safeguard a whole range of different parts of the economy so that you don't have these scarring effects, these hystereses, and other potentially damaging effects on the economy. So I think we learned on the policy side many things, and we did build up some buffers and safeguards in finance, a bit more liquidity requirement, and some steps which did try to harden the system. But so I think you can look at evidence that we were a bit better prepared. But I think where we failed is we failed to grapple with the dangers of systemic crises. That what we did in response to the last crisis was to basically look at how we could harden the financial system, and the whole thing was about putting in place the buffers and safeguards so that finance didn't become a problem for the real economy. And this time we were hit by a shock somewhere else that basically overwhelmed the financial system initially, but it was from the real economy to the financial system. Last time it was the other way around. I don't think in general we're very good at building systems, human-made systems, which give adequate notice of resilience. We built systems to be efficient, and that's based on the economic paradigm that we have. If everything is efficient, then we can be pretty flexible in response to shocks. That's our logic. And but we've seen that these cascading shocks, a small perturbation on the system can emerge somewhere, and then it can spread rapidly through the whole system. And our system is so interconnected now, the global system, international production systems, where we are dependent on components from often very concentrated locations of production. That makes it very vulnerable. And so these value chains collapsed when China went down because a lot of components that were needed in the value chain elsewhere weren't available. Healthcare systems also. We've stressed the need to have an efficient, cost-effective healthcare system, but then they're not built to be resilient to the type of shock that COVID represented. So I think this crisis, it represents an opportunity to have a better balance between the efficiency of the system and the resilience of the system. So we don't build these things to fail. They're built to be lean up to the point of failure. And another point is that we still haven't moved away from the idea that optimization should be the central goal of policy. So we try to optimize in terms of economic growth, in terms of productivity, in terms of innovation. That's really the goal. But an insight from system science is that if you try to optimize a complex system, you can destabilize parts of it. So that's not a lesson that we've learned at all. I think we still believe that we can optimize things and there are no negative consequences. What's more, the narrative is if we don't optimize, then you'll also have social problems and you won't be able to do anything about the environment. So I'm not sure that that logic is quite right. And whether we're ready to build a lot of slack, redundancy, reserves, stockpiles, whether we're ready to build all these things into public systems, into economic systems, I'm not sure. And it's not that easy a question either, because take healthcare for example. That Japan, for instance, often is perceived to have not a particularly efficient healthcare system, but because of its lack of efficiency, it actually stood up to the crisis of coronavirus quite well. So does years of inefficiency, is that compensated for by being ready in the face of a shock? That's not a very easy question. And when you're talking about public resources, public money, which are finite, which there's a lot of scrutiny over, there are very difficult trade-offs, perhaps, but difficult association. And so just to sum up, I think as ever, we've learned some of the lessons, but keeping pace with the way that our economy is self-organizing and the way it's becoming more and more interconnected, and how systems to function properly are reliant on a whole range of other systems. It's not that if the hospital system was effective, we would have been fine during the COVID crisis. We need production systems that can guarantee PPE and eventually vaccines. But if we don't have systems which are resilient enough, then they can collapse in a cascading fashion. And then you may harden one part of the system, but then you have a problem in another part of the system.
As you were mentioning, like globalization, that we're based on such complex and intertwined systems to deliver goods and services. I mean, we saw it during the COVID-19 crisis, mainly in the first place with medical support and medical equipment. There are also talks going on in the European Union, or like in Europe in general, talking about relocalization of production areas in the close region, so to say. Do you think this would make sense to really foster these dialogues and debates to relocalize production facilities in sectors that are very, very crucial for the European economy?
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting debate, but there's a real danger in this debate as well, that we, again, might learn the wrong lessons. I think, first of all, we need to really understand why there's fragility in the international production system. I don't think it's necessarily because you have a globally dispersed value chain for certain products. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. The problem is more that it's the concentration of vital capacities. That if you look at how industries have become consolidated, it used to be, if you take, for example, in the United States, the aerospace industry in the 1990s had over 100 contractors, 100 firms producing all sorts of things. Nowadays, you have 5. And you go across the line. You look at pharmaceuticals, where you've had massive concentration, where you now only have a few very massive firms. Even look at high-tech industries, where, again, you have massive consolidation. You have a few firms, the GAFA, which really dominate the industry. And if you only have a few producers, then you're very fragile. So probably, and I think we do need to distinguish, as you did in your question, between normal consumer goods and actually goods which are vital, ones which have strategic importance, and things that we actually do need in a crisis, like PPE, like vaccines, etc. And we need to distinguish those, because I think there isn't really a challenge to industries like electronics. There, I think the system works quite well, and we should perhaps continue with that. But for these sensitive products, I think we do need to make sure that we have capacities which have multiple producers, so that we don't become dependent on one source or a couple of sources. There's no reason why we shouldn't overproduce some things. Now, that's not market logic, but it is more thinking about the strategic needs that nations have. And at the European level, I think there's lots of things that can be coordinated, so that you do have these buffers and safeguards if needed. But I think we should learn the right lesson and not go too far. It doesn't mean we need to localize and near source all production. I don't think that's the wrong lesson. I think we do need a more resilient international system, which is based on more production, and probably, the rule of 4 or the rule of 5, that we should have at least 5 producers of any component or product dispersed globally, so that we're not reliant on one location, one place, or one firm. Because obviously the monopoly power is important, and it needs to be checked, because we have had massive consolidation. And so if we have a more competitive international production system, I think it will be more resilient. So just to sum up, I don't think the problem is globalization. I think the problem is monopolization. And I think the focus of policymakers should be on solving that, rather than questioning or moving against globalization.
Hynes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I think we covered a wide range of topics, and thank you for the interview.
Great. Thanks a lot, Nicholas.
And all the best for you in Ireland.
To you. Take care.
Thank you. See you soon.
See you.